right, so this is objective 1B. 1B covers organic chemistry, which talks about your macromolecules, and specifically 1B2 is going to go a little bit more in depth on enzyme structure and function, and enzymes are a special class of proteins. Now, in order for something to be classified as organic, it must contain carbon and hydrogen. And so all of your major organic compounds, or macromolecules, MRC stands for major organic compounds, are going to contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And what makes them different is what other elements are attached to it, and also the arrangement of that carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, because structure dictates function. So we're going to talk about the four major organic compounds, which are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Now, of those four, three of them can form polymers, which are going to be your carbs, your proteins, and your nucleic acids. Lipids do not form polymers. Each class of lipid itself is a monomer, okay? And the others have a monomer which can come together to make polymers. So let's start off with the carbohydrate. The carbohydrate is composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It tells you in its name it is a carbohydrate. So it's composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And what's unique about carbohydrates in that arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen is in their monomers, you're going to have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for every carbon, it's going to be 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So it's like for every carbon, there's a water molecule, CH2O. So the structure of your carbohydrates, they're going to come in monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polysaccharides. A monosaccharide is one sugar. Mono is one, saccharide is sugar. So these are your simple sugars. These are going to be things like glucose, fructose, galactose, so forth and so on. Disaccharides would be like table sugar, malt sugar, milk sugar. There's going to be 2 sugars together, and then polysaccharides are going to be many sugars bonded together. We're going to focus on the monosaccharides and the polysaccharides. Our monosaccharide glucose is our ideal sugar. You'll hear that one a lot. Has a chemical formula C6H12O6, but so does fructose and galactose. They also have C6H12O6. What makes them different is the arrangement. The main function of a carbohydrate is short-term energy storage, and energy is stored in the bonds between atoms. And when you have these carbon-hydrogen bonds, they are great for storing energy. So the main function is going to be short-term energy storage. Now, your polysaccharides that are used for storage in animals is going to be glycogen, and in plants it's going to be starch. So those potatoes, those are a starch. And they are a starch because they are storing glucose monomers. Your secondary function for a carbohydrate is going to be structure. Specifically, we look at the polysaccharides here. In animals and fungi, there's something called chitin. In certain types of, and not all animals, some types of animals, ones that have exoskeletons, they're made up of chitin. And in fungi, chitin is found in the cell walls of fungus. In plants, you're going to have cellulose, which is also found in the cell walls of plants. So those are basically polymers of glucose, and they are used in a structured format. Some other things about carbohydrates to remember, most of them, not all, most are going to end with ose, glucose, fructose, galactose, cellulose. And in the monomers, you're going to have that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And again, the main function of a carbohydrate is short-term energy storage, which is why during photosynthesis, the chloroplast stores this newly converted light energy that has been converted to chemical energy in the bonds of carbohydrates, because its job is to store energy for short term. Now, our next class of macromolecule is going to be the lipid. The lipid is composed, most of them are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There's a P here for phosphorus in parentheses because there is a lipid that uses phosphorus, which is very important. The 4 classes of lipids, and again, these guys themselves are monomers. They don't combine with other ones to make bigger polymers. The first one is going to be your triglyceride, which is the most common. The triglyceride is composed of glycerol and 3 fatty acids. It kind of looks like an E. Its main function is going to be long-term energy storage. It has a bunch of carbon and hydrogens with very little oxygen. So even though, like the carbohydrate, is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, here, if you have 6 carbons, you're probably going to have 6 oxygens. Here, you'll have like 40 carbons and 3 oxygens. So there's a big difference in the structure there, because these fatty acid chains are long hydrocarbon chains, a bunch of carbon and hydrogen. Long-term energy storage is going to be the main function, but they're also used for insulation and protection of organs. And they're commonly known as fats and oils. Your triglycerides are. Your next class of lipid is the phospholipid. It tells you it contains more than carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in its name. It also contains phosphorus. So basically what happens is one of the fatty acids is replaced with a phosphate group. So I still have my glycerol, I still have my 2 fatty acid chains, but one of the chains is replaced with the phosphate group. And phosphate carries a negative charge. And so it is something that we consider to be hydrophilic, whereas your hydrocarbon chains are non-polar bonds and they're hydrophobic. That is important in how the phospholipid functions because the phospholipid functions for membrane structure. In an aqueous or water environment, phospholipids form a two-layer, a bilayer of phospholipids, putting the tails to the inside and the heads on the outside, which is the main structure of a cell membrane. So the heads are hydrophilic and the tails are hydrophobic, and this makes us an amphipathic molecule, which gives a membrane a semi-permeable barrier, creates a semi-permeable barrier. The next type of lipid is a steroid. They have 4 fused hydrocarbon rings and fatty acid chain attached to that. Their function is chemical messengers, but they also aid in membrane structure. They are a part of the cell membrane and they help to keep the phospholipids from getting too close together or too far apart, depending on temperature. And our main types of lipid steroids are going to be your sex hormones, so estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and they're all built from the base of cholesterol. Cholesterol is going to be the one you're going to find in the membrane structure. The last type of lipid is going to be wax. So like earwax, beeswax, those types of waxes. Waxes are fatty acids and they have other constituents attached to them. Their main purpose is water insulation. So they either keep water in or they keep water out. If you ever look at a leaf on the top of it, it's going to have a waxy covering, which helps to prevent water loss, especially in plants that are in dry areas. Okay, so those are going to be your lipids. And again, lipids, there's 4 different classes of lipids, but the main one is going to be your triglyceride, which is used for long-term energy storage. Our next class of macromolecule is the protein. Proteins are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And you see this S here, and for suffer in parentheses, because proteins form disulfide bridges when they form their structures, which is extremely important for the structure, the tertiary structures of the proteins. And so those disulfide bridges are important. Now, proteins are made of amino acids. There's 20 different amino acids, but amino acids all have the same backbone. They have this central carbon, and coming from the central carbon, on one side you have an amine group. This is where you're going to get your nitrogen. On the other side, you have a carboxyl or a carboxylic acid group. And so this is where you're going to have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen as well. But in the middle, the central carbon, you have something called an R group. And this is the variable. And this is where you get those 20 different variations that give you your 20 different amino acids. Now, proteins do all the things. Remember, DNA is transcribed to RNA, RNA is translated to proteins, and proteins are expressed as your traits. So proteins are used for structure and catalysts. Those are going to be some of the main functions, but they also function in your immune system and transport. You find proteins in the structure of a cell membrane as well, because they allow certain things to cross the membrane that can't go directly across that membrane. And one thing to remember is, in addition to there being 20 different types, your digestive enzymes, which we talk a lot about, tend to end with ACE. And so proteins are going to be specific for things like temperature, pH, and salinity, because they undergo up to four different levels of folding. You have your primary structure, which is this chain of amino acids. Then your secondary structure, where it forms a beta sheet or an alpha helix. Tertiary structure, where it folds into a subunit. And enzymes, all enzymes go to at least tertiary, so they're extensively folded to make that active site, which is extremely important. And then some of them get multiple subunits put together, which is your quaternary structure. So enzymes are extensively folded, and if you take them outside of their normal range of pH, temperature, or salinity, which is the amount of salt in the solution, they begin to unfold and ultimately can denature. And again, structure determines function. So proteins are very, very sensitive for their environment. And when we talk about enzymes, I'll explain more then. The last class of macromolecules is going to be your nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The monomer for a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. The nucleotide is made up of 3 parts. There's a nitrogen base, a sugar, and a phosphate group. Now, that nitrogen base can be adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, or uracil, where Adenine, guanine, and cytosine can be found in any type of nucleic acid, but thymine is exclusive to DNA, and uracil is exclusive to RNA. The sugar, there is a 5-carbon sugar, it's called a pentose. It's either going to be ribose if it's RNA or deoxyribose if it's DNA. And there's going to be a phosphate group. The main function of the nucleic acid is to store and transmit genetic information and to do protein synthesis. DNA stores and transmits genetic information, and your RNA is going to be responsible for protein synthesis. A secondary function, which we don't really talk about in nucleic acids, is that they serve as energy molecules, because your ATP is actually a modified RNA nucleotide. You add 2 additional phosphate groups, so they serve as energy. They function as energy molecules as well, like ATP and GTP. But RNA stands for ribonucleic acid, and DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. Deuces.